I speak now as an old man whose beard has turned the color of winter frost, sitting alone beside a candle whose trembling flame moves as slowly as my breath. The night is quiet, yet beneath that quiet lies the restless movement of memory, rising like smoke from embers that never truly died. When the hour grows late, and the corridors of the palace fall silent, I often find myself returning to the earliest turning points of my life, moments when I was still too young to understand how the smallest breath of fate can alter the course of an entire empire. And among those memories, one stands apart like a solitary statue in a vast hall. The moment when Emperor Hadrian first saw something in me that I myself could not yet see. It was a time when Rome felt enormous around me, when marble arches towered like mountains, when the fragrance of parchment and candle wax seemed to define my entire world. I had always been a quiet child, drawn not to games or noise but to old books, old wisdom, and old stones. Other boys raced through the palace gardens, laughing under the warm Roman sun. But I preferred the shade of the libraries where dust floated in golden shafts of afternoon light. The scent of ink and parchment felt as comforting as a mother's embrace, and I would run my fingers over the worn edges of scrolls the way one traces the wrinkles of a beloved elder's hands. Even then I felt the fragility of time, sensed how everything around me, statues, gardens, people, would one day turn to dust. It made me hungry for meaning, for understanding, for something that would outlast the decay of the world. My tutors often complained that I was too serious for my age, too contemplative, too willing to sit alone for hours. Rusticus, a stern but gentle man, once said I seemed to live half in this world and half in some inner realm where only thought itself mattered. He was right. Even as a child I felt the weight of life pressing inward, demanding questions I wasn't yet old enough to answer. And so I turned to the philosophers Zeno, Epictetus, Cleanthes, seeking from them a language to steady the storms inside me. Their words felt like stones beneath a rushing river, something firm to stand upon when fear or uncertainty pulled me away from myself. It was on a cool spring afternoon, with rain clouds gathering over the distant hills, that Hadrian first noticed me. The palace grounds were nearly empty, the scent of wet earth drifting through the gardens. I sat on a worn stone bench beneath a statue of a long-dead thinker, reading a scroll Rusticus had placed in my hands that morning. On it were words I did not yet understand. If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your judgment of it. I remember staring at that sentence for a long time, my young mind trying to grasp how something so simple could feel so heavy. Footsteps approached, slow, measured, purposeful. I thought perhaps a servant or a guard had wandered into the garden. But when I lifted my gaze, I saw Emperor Hadrian himself standing before me. His face was stern, carved by years of leadership and war, yet his eyes held a sharp, penetrating curiosity. I rose at once, my hands trembling as I lowered the scroll and bowed. But he lifted a hand, stopping me. "Sit," he said. His voice was calm, almost weary. He lowered himself onto the bench beside me, his cloak settling heavily around him. For a moment he said nothing, simply observing the rippling reflection of the clouds in the nearby pool. Then he turned his gaze toward me with a softness I did not expect. "What is it you are reading?" he asked. I handed him the scroll, unsure if my voice would remain steady. He unrolled it, read the passage, and then nodded to himself. "Rusticus," he murmured, "always giving children the weight of the heavens to carry." He returned the scroll to me and studied my expression. "Do you understand it?" I shook my head slightly. "Not yet," I whispered. "Good," he replied. "Understanding should never come too isolate. If it does, it has no roots." We sat in silence for a long time, the air cool against my skin. Hadrian was not known for seeking out children, nor for spending time in quiet contemplation with them. Yet in that moment he seemed content simply to be present, as though he were testing not my knowledge but my spirit. Eventually he spoke again. "Tell me, Marcus," he said, "why do you spend your days with these old philosophers instead of playing with others your age?" I hesitated, unsure if honesty would offend him, but the truth slipped out. "Because the world feels too loud," I said softly, "too uncertain. When I read, I feel steadier." He nodded slowly. "There is strength in seeking stillness." Another silence passed between us, filled only by the sound of distant thunder rolling across the sky. Hadrian's eyes drifted over the garden, over the marble statues glistening with the first drops of rain. Then he turned back to me. "You are not like other boys," he said. "Most crave attention. You seek understanding. Most grasp at the world. You observe it." He paused. "Rome will need someone like you one day." I felt a strange pressure in my chest. Part fear, part disbelief. "Need me?" I asked for what he did not answer. Or rather, his answer came in the form of a long, measured look that settled deep into my memory. It was the look of a man searching not for talent or ambition, but for character, for integrity, for someone who did not yet know what he could become. In the weeks that followed, Hadrian summoned me often. Sometimes he questioned me about virtue, duty, fear. Sometimes he challenged my patience with sharp contradictions. Sometimes he observed how I handled silence, discomfort, or loss of certainty. He was not testing my intelligence. He was testing the core of my being. One morning he led me into a quiet hall lined with ancient busts of philosophers. Their stone eyes seemed to watch us as we walked. The air smelled of candle smoke and old marble. Hadrian placed a hand on my shoulder and asked, "What do you want from life, Marcus?" I looked at the flickering candlelight dancing across the walls and answered honestly. "To understand how to live rightly." He exhaled softly, as though the answer gave him both relief and sorrow. "Then perhaps," he said, "you will one day understand why I have taken such interest in you." Rumors soon spread through the palace. Servants whispered that the emperor spent too much time with a quiet boy. Senators speculated that Hadrian saw something dangerous or powerful in me. Some praised it, others feared it. I felt none of their excitement, only confusion. I had not sought his attention, nor did I understand the weight that came with it. But Hadrian understood. He saw the world shifting around him, saw Rome standing at the edge of storms yet to come, and he knew, long before I did, that a soul shaped by reflection, humility, and inner steadiness might one day be needed not for glory, but for endurance. That was the beginning. I speak again from the quiet of my final years, sitting beside a candle whose small flame dances in the faint breeze drifting through the open window. The late-night air carries the scent of distant rain and the softness of Roman spring, and these familiar sensations open another corridor of memory, where the first part of this story revealed how Emperor Hadrian first noticed me. The path ahead tells how he began shaping a destiny that would soon surround me like a cloak far heavier than my youth could bear. I did not yet realize that every conversation, every test, every moment of silence he placed before me was part of a design larger than anything I could imagine. After that first encounter in the garden, the palace itself seemed to change around me. The marble floors felt colder, the shadows deeper, the distant echo of footsteps more meaningful. Hadrian would summon me unexpectedly, sometimes at dawn when the world still lay wrapped in mist, sometimes at dusk when the sun bled into the horizon and turned the sky a deep burning red. I never knew why he wanted my presence, and that uncertainty weighed on me more than any question he ever asked. One morning he ordered me brought to the Hall of Maps, a vast chamber where the entire known world sprawled across stone walls, mountains carved in dark strokes, its seas painted in swirling shades of blue, distant borders drawn with the precision of a scholar and the ambition of an emperor. Hadrian stood before the map of the northern frontiers, his hands clasped behind his back. The hall was silent except for the faint crackle of torches. "Marcus," he said without looking at me, "tell me what you see." I stepped beside him, studying the wild lands beyond the empire. "No," he replied. "You see the limits of men. Rome will stretch and shrink long after you and I are gone, but the true border is always the courage of those who lead it." He tapped the map lightly. "Remember this, an empire is not governed by territory, but by the character of the one who carries its burdens." His words unsettled me, as though he were placing bricks upon my shoulders one by one, but he did not stop there. He led me through halls lined with bronze busts of former emperors, Augustus, Tiberius, Trajan, one watching us silently with empty stone eyes. Hadrian paused before Trajan's image and rested his hand upon the cool metal. "Greatness," he said, "is never the goal. It is the shadow that follows when one walks the path of duty." I did not fully understand, yet the weight of his words pressed deep into my young mind. It felt as if he were preparing me for something nameless, something vast. As the months passed, Hadrian's health worsened. His cough echoed through the palace halls, sharp and persistent. Sometimes he leaned heavily on servants as he walked, his breath short, his voice strained. Yet even then, even with death lingering around him like a silent companion, he summoned me more frequently. His gaze grew softer, but his questions sharper. One evening he requested my presence in a quiet chamber lit only by the glow of a single oil lamp. Scrolls lay scattered across a table, and the scent of burning olive oil filled the air. He gestured for me to sit. "Marcus," he said, "you have lived your life among scrolls, statues, and silence. But the world beyond these walls is harsher than philosophy will ever admit. Tell me, what do you believe is the greatest challenge a ruler must face?" I hesitated, thinking of soldiers, war, famine, plague. But something deeper stirred in me, something I had felt even in my young years. "Fear," I whispered. "Fear of failing the people who depend on you." Hadrian leaned back slightly, studying my face with an expression that mixed approval and sorrow. "Yes," he said, "the fear that one's strength will not be enough. The fear that decisions made in good faith will still bring suffering. The fear of becoming what power can shape men into." He lowered his voice. "A ruler must wrestle with himself more than with any enemy." Those words would follow me through decades, through wars, loss, grief, and impossible choices. But then, I was only a boy trying to understand a man's world. Hadrian eventually began involving me in private discussions with senators. I sat quietly at the edge of long wooden tables, the ivory carvings gleaming beneath the torchlight. The senators' voices rose and fell like waves, full of argument, ego, and ambition. I learned quickly that power was rarely spoken plainly. It was hidden in glances, in pauses, in the weight of silence. Hadrian watched how I reacted to these meetings. He watched how I listened. He watched whether arrogance tempted me. Late one afternoon, as the sky outside turned the color of dying embers, he dismissed everyone except me. The senators bowed and withdrew, their robes brushing softly across the marble. Hadrian remained seated, his shoulders slumped, his face weary. He motioned me closer. "You are seeing what lies beneath Rome's beauty," he said. "You see how men cling to status as if it were life itself, how they fear losing influence more than losing virtue." His gaze pierced me. "A time will come when you must decide whether to rise above such things." His words struck me like cold water. Until then I had imagined the world of leaders as a place of reason and duty. Now I understood that it was a battlefield of minds long before it was a battlefield of swords. As Hadrian's body weakened further, the palace grew tense. Physicians whispered to one another in darkened corners. Servants moved more quietly, as though afraid the slightest noise might quicken the emperor's decline. Nights became restless. The smell of burning incense lingered in every corridor, meant to purify the air or perhaps to comfort the soul. Then came the evening that shaped everything. Hadrian summoned me once more, but this time his voice delivered by a servant carried urgency. When I entered his chamber, the air felt heavy, thick with the scent of herbs. The emperor lay propped against cushions, his breath slow and labored. Moonlight streamed through the open window, casting long shadows across the stone floor. He beckoned me close with a trembling hand. "Marcus," he whispered, "the time has come." I knelt beside him, my heart pounding. "You must understand why I have chosen you," he said. "Rome needs strength, yes, but not the strength of a lion or a soldier. It needs the strength of a man who does not seek glory, a man who knows himself, a man who understands that power is merely a tool for service." I felt tears sting my eyes, tears born not of sorrow alone but of the weight settling upon me. "I am not ready," I said softly. "No one ever is," he answered, his voice little more than a breath. "But destiny does not wait for readiness. It arrives, and we must rise to meet it." He reached for a scroll lying on the table beside him, the same one that declared his desire for Antoninus Pius to adopt me. His hand trembled as he placed it in mine. "This is not a burden," he whispered. "It is an inheritance of duty." For a long time we remained there, he fading like a candle in its final moments, and I staring at the scroll that would alter the course of my life. When I left the chamber, the hallways felt colder than ever. The statues watching from the shadows seemed to hold their breath. A storm was gathering in the distance, both in the sky and within my heart. That night I understood, perhaps for the first time, that the road before me would demand everything I had done more. I speak now with the same trembling breath that accompanies old age, and as I sit beside a small candle whose flame bends each time the night wind sighs through the shutters, I return once more to the path that unfolded after Hadrian placed destiny into my hands. His words continued echoing in my mind long after I left his chamber that night, that no one is ever ready, that duty is an inheritance one must accept, even when fear coils quietly in the heart. As the moon carved pale shapes across the marble floors of the palace, I knew a threshold had been crossed. The world I had walked through as a student, a quiet observer among scrolls and statues, was disappearing. Before me stretched the long corridor of responsibility, its end hidden somewhere beyond the horizon of my youth. In the days that followed Hadrian's final declaration, the palace seemed to breathe differently. Every servant's step carried a gravity I had not felt before. Every senator's greeting held an extra note of curiosity or caution. They knew what Hadrian had done. Word travels quickly through halls of marble, especially when the world within them waits for a dying emperor's last arrangement. And so I walked through those days as though moving across a shifting bridge, one that trembled beneath my feet with each new glance sent my way. Antoninus Pius, still simply Antoninus, then was summoned to Hadrian's side. When he emerged hours later, the lines in his face were deeper, but his expression was steady, almost serene. He passed me in the corridor, paused, and placed his hand gently upon my shoulder. It was a silent gesture, but in it I felt both comfort and warning. His adoption would bind us in a way neither of us had chosen, and yet both of us would carry the consequences. I would learn in time that Antoninus possessed a rare constancy, a calmness that never faltered even when storms gathered at every border of the empire. But at that moment, we were two men standing on the edge of a future shaped by another's hand. Hadrian's decline worsened quickly. Physicians moved like shadows in the night, their voices hushed, their eyes troubled. I visited him once more before the end. The chamber was dim, lit only by the soft flicker of an oil lamp. The emperor's breath was faint, his skin pale, his body diminished almost beyond recognition. Yet when he opened his eyes and saw me, something like clarity passed across his face. "Marcus," he whispered, though the word was barely sound. "Do not forget what you were meant to be." His hand found mine, weak and fragile. In that moment I felt neither triumph nor pride, only a profound sorrow for the burden he believed I could carry. When he closed his eyes again, I knew they would not open for me another time. News of his death spread across Rome like a deep, mournful tide. Bells sounded at dawn, their tones heavy and lingering in the cool morning air. Crowds gathered in the streets, some wept openly, others stood in solemn silence. Hadrian had ruled with both brilliance and severity, and his legacy stirred mixed emotions: admiration, fear, gratitude, resentment. Yet regardless of sentiment, the city felt the shift in its bones. An emperor had fallen. The world of Rome was turning again. Antoninus Pius ascended to the throne, fulfilling Hadrian's final wish, and as he stood before the Senate, calm and dignified, he formally adopted both me and Lucius Verus. The adoption ceremony was a blur of solemn vows, ceremonial garments, and the sound of voices echoing beneath the great dome of the Senate Hall. My name was spoken with an authority that felt almost unreal. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, a name shaped by the will of emperors, a name that would come to define the rest of my life. I remember standing before a statue of Augustus afterward, studying the carved stone that depicted the first emperor of Rome. His marble eyes stared forward with calm certainty, as though he had foreseen every ruler who would follow him. I wondered what he would think of me, a youth who did not seek power but had been placed upon its path. In the silence of that hall, with dust shimmering in the shafts of afternoon light, I whispered a line that would later find its place in my meditations. The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it. And in that moment it felt less like philosophy and more like a quiet surrender to the course ahead. Antoninus did not rush my education. Instead, he guided me with a gentleness that I came to admire deeply. He insisted I continue my philosophical studies, reminding me that an emperor who does not think is merely a soldier with a crown. He invited me to his private councils, not to speak, but to observe. I watched him manage disputes with patience, weigh arguments with fairness, and reject flattery without hesitation. He ruled not with fear, but with measured kindness. One evening, as we walked through the palace gardens, the air cool and fragrant with cypress, Antoninus spoke to me with a rare openness. "Hadrian saw something in you," he said, "but what matters now is what you see in yourself. Power reveals a man's character. It does not create it." His words settled deep within me. I thought of the long nights spent studying Stoicism, the scrolls I had read until the candle burned low. I recalled Epictetus' teachings about the discipline of perception, about recognizing what is within one's control and what is not, and I realized that my path, however daunting, was shaped not only by emperors but by the mind I had been cultivating since childhood. Months turned into years. I married Faustina, Antoninus' daughter, who met life with an energy and warmth that often balanced my introspective nature. Her laughter filled the quiet corners of the palace. Her compassion touched those who served us, and her presence reminded me that even a future emperor is still a man who needs the grounding of family. We welcomed children, some of whom the gods allowed to remain with us, others whom fate took too soon. Their tiny breaths, their fragile lives, their loss, these were the moments that left the deepest marks on my heart. Philosophy teaches resilience, but grief teaches humility. Despite the quiet domestic joys, the empire always loomed at the edge of my thoughts. I could feel Rome preparing for the years ahead, as though the marble buildings themselves sensed the coming shifts. The frontiers grew restless. Reports arrived from legions stationed across distant landstripes testing boundaries, disputes arising between provinces, whispers of tension building like storm clouds gathering over mountains. Antoninus met each issue with patience and wisdom, but even his steady leadership could not calm everything. The smell of parchment, the dim glow of lanterns, the faint sound of distant footsteps, these things felt like anchors in a world that was slowly changing shape around me. I often paused to read my favorite line from Heraclitus: "No man steps into the same river twice." The waters were shifting, and I felt myself standing at their edge, waiting for the moment I would be asked to step into them. One autumn morning, Antoninus called me to his private chamber. He was older now, his hair nearly white, his movements slower, yet his eyes still carried the same clarity, the same unwavering strength I had always known. "Marcus," he said, motioning for me to sit, "it is time for you to begin accepting responsibilities that cannot be learned from books alone." What followed were months of immersion into the machinery of empire: legal disputes, provincial management, military strategy, economic regulation. It was as though Antoninus were handing me the tools of a vast mechanism and teaching me how each piece turned the next. I learned how a single grain shortage in Egypt could ripple through the streets of Rome, how a feud between provincial governors could ignite civil unrest, how a legion's morale could determine the stability of an entire region. Yet even as the lessons intensified, Antoninus never hardened toward me. He would end each council with words of encouragement, often reminding me of something I once wrote in my meditations: "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." I began to internalize those words more deeply. I understood that an emperor must first govern his own mind before he can govern others. But beneath the growing confidence, there remained a quiet unease. I knew that Antoninus, though seemingly eternal in his steadiness, could not rule forever, and when he left this world, the full weight of Rome would fall upon my shoulders. The thought lingered like a shadow behind every lesson he taught. One winter night, as snow fell softly against the palace roof and the wind moaned through the narrow courtyards, I lay awake beside the dim glow of the hearth. I could smell the smoke, feel the cold seeping beneath the door, hear the distant rustle of guards shifting their weight in the halls. and in that stillness I realized something profound. Hadrian had chosen me not for who I was then, but for who I would need to become. The empire was preparing for the next chapter, and so was I. I speak now with a voice softened by age, like parchment worn at the edges by countless hands. The candle beside me burns low, its flame swaying gently each time the cold night drafts slip through the cracks of the shutter. In this wavering glow, the memories of my final ascent toward emperorship gather once more, rising like the mist that clings to the forests outside Rome at dawn. What I tell now is the last movement of a long journey, the final shaping of a destiny Hadrian placed into my hands when I was scarcely more than a boy. And as I draw these recollections together, I hear the distant echo of my younger footsteps across the marble halls of the palace, each one carrying me closer to the moment when the empire would finally rest upon my shoulders. The years pass beneath Antoninus Pius, much like a slow river under a winter sky. From a distance, the water appears calm, but beneath the surface, currents shift and swirl with silent force. So it was with Rome. The peace of Antoninus' reign was not the peace of stillness, but the peace of disciplined balance. Every rising tension at the borders was answered with patient diplomacy. Every internal dispute was tempered with reason. The emperor ruled with the steadiness of a man who understood that strength does not always roar. Often it whispers, choosing restraint over spectacle. Yet even as Rome prospered, I sensed the inevitable unfolding. Age touched Antoninus in the way frost slowly climbs the branches of a cypress, first softly, then relentlessly. His steps became shorter, his pauses longer. Seated beside him in council, I began noticing the faint tremble in his hands, the weariness in his eyes when the senators' debate stretched deep into the afternoon. He never complained. He never stepped aside. He bore his duties with a dignity that taught me more than any philosophical teacher ever could. One quiet morning, as the sun rose pale and thin through the mist, he called me to his private chamber. The scent of cedar filled the room, mingling with the faint smell of ink from the scrolls spread across his desk. He was seated beside the window, looking out toward the distant hills where the early fog clung to the earth like a shroud. "Marcus," he said softly, "come sit with me." I did as he asked. There was something different in his voice, something weighted yet peaceful. For a long moment he did not speak. He simply watched the morning light creep across the floor. "My son," he said at last, "I have taught you everything I can. What remains, you must learn on your own." I felt my chest tighten, though I had known this moment would come. Knowing does not soften its arrival. He turned to me with eyes that held both affection and solemn truth. "Hadrian chose you for reasons I cannot fully measure, but I have seen those reasons prove themselves over the years. The empire will ask much of you, more than any man should be asked to give. Yet you will give it." I tried to speak, but my words tangled in my throat like roots beneath snow. He reached out, placing his hand atop mine. His skin was cool, the hand of a man nearing the end of winter. "You will not rule by anger," he whispered, "nor by fear. You will rule by the discipline of your own soul." His words struck something deep within me. They resonated with the meditations I had written in quiet moments. Among them the line I had repeated to myself often: "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." I understood then that the emperor who shaped me had not only prepared me to govern the world, but to govern myself. Winter deepened, the palace felt colder, the days quieter. Snow gathered along the edges of the courtyards, and frost clung to the statues that lined the atrium, giving them an otherworldly glow beneath the torchlight. Rumors began whispering through Rome that the emperor's health was failing. But Antoninus remained dutiful, attending councils when he could, issuing decrees with precise clarity, resting only when absolutely necessary. Then, one evening, as I studied reports from the northern frontiers, a servant knocked gently at my chamber door. His face was pale, his eyes dimmed by fear. "My lord," he whispered, "the emperor requests your presence." I followed him through silent corridors until we reached the emperor's chamber. The room was dim, warmed only by a small brazier burning softly in the corner. Antoninus lay upon his bed, his breathing shallow yet steady. When he saw me approach, a faint smile touched his lips. "Marcus," he murmured, "it is time." I knelt beside him, taking his hand. It trembled lightly, like a leaf stirred by a soft wind. "Promise me something," he said. "Anything," I whispered. "Do not let the world harden your heart. Rome will test you, pain will test you, loss will test you. But remember what I tried to teach you. Remember that virtue is not a shield against suffering. It is the strength that allows you to walk through it." A faint cough shook him, and when he regained his breath, he added, "And hold fast to reason. Even when your heart breaks, even when everything seems uncertain." His eyes lingered on mine. Then, with what strength remained, he whispered a final instruction: "When I am gone, offer the watchword to the captain of the guard. The word is equality." I felt my breath catch. Even in his last act he chose a word that reflected his entire life: fairness, balance, justice. That night, as the cold wind pressed against the palace walls and the moon cast long shadows across the floor, Antoninus Pius passed from this world with the quiet dignity that had defined every moment of his reign. The next morning Rome awoke to mourning. Bells tolled across the city, the sound deep and solemn, rolling through the narrow streets and open forums alike. The people gathered in clusters, some in sorrow, others in reverent silence. Senators donned dark robes, their expressions grave. Soldiers lined the palace gates, their armor gleaming beneath the winter sun. I walked to the captain of the guard, my heart heavy, my steps slow. When he looked at me, awaiting the word that would signal Rome's next chapter, I spoke with a voice that trembled slightly yet carried the weight of duty. Equality. The captain bowed his head and stepped aside. The path before me opened. But even then, I did not feel like a man ascending to power. Instead, I felt like someone standing at the edge of a vast, cold sea. In the days that followed, preparations for my accession unfolded with the solemnity of ancient ritual. Senators approached me with formal vows. Scribes recorded decrees on fresh parchment, and citizens gathered to witness the beginning of a new chapter. Yet amid all of this, I found myself returning often to the quiet corners of the palace where I had once studied philosophy as a young man. I sought comfort in the familiar scent of parchment, in the gentle flicker of lamplight, in the silence that wrapped itself around the scroll-filled chamber like a warm cloak. As I walked among the shelves, I whispered to myself the lines that had guided me for years. Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together. Through this I understood that destiny is not the force that crushes a man, but the fire that shapes him. When the day of my accession came, the forum was filled with a sea of faces. The sky was a pale blue, streaked with thin clouds that drifted slowly across the horizon. As I stepped forward, wearing the imperial cloak that had once rested on the shoulders of Antoninus, I felt the weight of Rome settle upon me, not as a crushing burden, but as a solemn call. The marble beneath my feet was cold. The air held the scent of incense. Somewhere in the distance a child cried, and an old man whispered a prayer. And in that moment I understood fully what Hadrian had foreseen, what Antoninus had shaped, what fate had prepared. I would not be the emperor of conquest. I would not be the emperor of spectacle. I would be the emperor who ruled first over his own mind, and through that, over the greatest empire the world had known. The flame of destiny, once placed trembling into my hands, now burned with steady purpose.